So we are now, it looks like 22 and 23 are related. Supervisor Miller.
Okay, this is the restoration of the courthouse, and I have quite a few questions on this one. Just to give some back, we're asking us to approve $3.5 million under these two contracts for the Old Courthouse, $1.3 million for design services and $2.2 million for the exterior rehab. The board received 3 memos over the past several months. One was on March, one was in August, one in September 6th. And all 3 of those memos identified the funding from leftover 2004 bonds originally intended for the rehab of the courthouse. And now we know that the Public Service Center overran by 100%, and they ended up at about $146 million on that facility per the county website. And my question is, this went from bonds, 2004 bonds, and there was also a report in the media, so a lot of people have been asking me a lot of questions about this, and now we're saying that this is going to be with 2014 COPS, that this is going to be funded out of those. First of all, why was there confusion over whether it was bonds or COPS? Was it just a typo or something?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, there really wasn't any confusion. What we were trying to convey was the fact that the board had authorized the transfer in 2013 of the $4.5 million of bonds set aside to restore the courthouse because we knew we were short in the Public Service Center. Mm-hmm. We then fully expended those, which means that when we expend bond funds, they're expended within a certain period of time in order to avoid arbitrage penalties. Mm-hmm. So those funds have been fully expended. We then estimated the cost to complete the Public Service Center, and we found that we basically are about $5.6 million overfunded in the COPS. So therefore, you could say, and I think that's what we did administratively, that had we known that we would have been backfilling these many COPS, we might not have transferred the bonds originally out of the courthouse. So I think that's why I use the words interchangeably. In essence, we're keeping faith with the voters because we're repairing the old courthouse at now a cost of about $5.6 million. So that's why we used interchangeably the word 2004 bonds.
Gotcha.
This particular, these two contracts are funded with the monies that were left over from the sale of COPS for the Public Service Center.
Okay. And then on Agenda 22, it's $1.3 roughly million to be awarded to Poster Frost Murto for architect and engineering design services. And in your March 31st memo, you included a report from them which included an estimate, an engineer's estimate for the work. They had hired a company called CompuSoft to do the estimate of the courthouse renovation. And the cost for that report was $57,000. This company, CompuSoft, estimated about $8.4 million for completion of this project without escalation, and $8.9 million with all the alternatives they had in there, and that excluded escalation as well. And then in the memo, you stated there was excessive administrative costs that were about 38%. This is your March 31st memo. You said they were contingency items and that you considered that estimate to be extremely high. That was in your memo. They included those costs, and in their estimate it was roughly for both of these items $1.7 million. $1.698 million is what CompuSoft estimated the cost of both of these items would be to approve, or excuse me, for the second item for number 23, which is just a second. Pull this up. My agenda. There. For number 23, which is the courthouse exterior rehab project. So they estimated that would be 1.7 million, and that was the contractor that M.W. Morrissey hired to do their estimate. And now we're looking at about 30% higher and asking us to approve 2.2 million. Can you explain the difference between these two and why there's a discrepancy?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, if you look at the earlier memorandums that I've directed on that, they were basically looking at not only the exterior repair but the interior replacement of the plumbing, mechanical, electrical systems. And I think there was about $3 million in that range. So what you have before you is actually the Poster Frost contract is really for tenant improvements for all of the tenants now, including the actual restoration of the interior of the courthouse for its tenants, and to be architecturally consistent with its original historic character. The item that you mentioned, the second contract, is the amount of, and this is a hard bid contract, and so it's an actual number. And we're going to get some variation over time between what may have been estimated in hard bid numbers when we get to it, simply because of the restoration of the building itself. So the 2.2 goes to all of the exterior, which is basically a restoration of the dome and any of the rest of the exterior work that's necessary to restore the integrity of the historic courthouse. We will then bring back sometime, probably in the next, my guess, 90, 120 days, tenant improvement contracts that talk about the amount of tenant improvements. Embedded in those tenant improvements now will be certain portions of the interior utilities that were basically they're not in this bid at this point in time. And then that we will then talk about apportioning those expenses between the users or the tenants and the agreements that we'll have with those, and then the further additional costs that the county may incur because of our obligations to provide the main backbone utility systems within the building itself.
The thing I don't understand is, how do we know what tenant improvements to do if we don't have any signed contracts with the tenants yet? How are we able to do that and apportion them back if we don't have contracts with them?
Yeah, Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, that's why we hire an architect, and they work with the tenants, design the improvements, and then apportion the cost. And many of the costs have to be accepted by the tenants that will move into the building. We will obviously negotiate the tenant agreements, and those tenant agreements will address the issue of how much of their particular improvements they're going to pay for, as well as the rent that will be charged by the county. And you will have all of that material along with agreements of the tenants well in advance to make a decision on whether or not you want to have that particular organization as a tenant inside the historic courthouse, functioning as a regional visitor center.
So we don't have tenant agreements, but we're going to go ahead and do these improvements before we have tenant agreements here.
Madam.
There was another item approved on August 2nd. We approved a master agreement for $3 million for historic preservation services for various departments, and I was curious, is any of that money being used? It was for the same contractor. Is any of that money being used for the courthouse?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, to my knowledge, no. And to answer your previous question or statement, we won't be spending any money on tenant improvements until we have signed contracts and leases with the tenants.
Oh, I thought that's what you were just saying, this 2.2 million included were some tenant improvements.
No, that's the exterior renovation of the courthouse.
Okay. And the other 1.3, that doesn't include any tenant improvements?
No.
The item number 20?
No, that's
No.
for design.
Okay. And the design doesn't include any tenant improvements in there?
The design does include the tenant improvements.
It does?
You're designing the tenant improvements. Then you have to build the tenant improvements.
Mhm.
We're paying for the design, but not building.
Okay. So if we look at on page 45 of the contract with Poster Frost that we're approving today, it states that the estimated construction budget shall not exceed 11.5 million. And this is over 3 million more than the 8.9 million that they estimated with all the alternatives, it's 35% higher. And then you had previously pointed out these excessive administrative costs that were included in there. Why would we be asked to approve a contract that is $3 million higher than what they originally came up with their estimate?
Madam Chair, Supervisor Miller, you're not being asked to approve a contract.
But they have in their contract in the background material, the 11.5
The
million.
11.5 is not to exceed.
Not
It
to
depends
exceed.
upon the tenant improvements. It depends upon the participation of the tenants and what type of improvements they want and what they're willing to pay for.
Okay, so we don't, the last question I have, we don't have any leases, and, okay, this one here. Okay, I guess my final comments on this are that this came before the board, or excuse me, this came before the voters in the bond election, and of all the propositions, this particular proposition's failed the most. 66% of the voters said no to this particular proposition. Yet here we are, thumbing our nose at the voters after they said no, and you heard many people here today talking about they want the roads fixed, they pay their taxes, they'd like some services, and people are hurting. And yet today we're approving moving forward with this contract that the voters just said no to. Building a visitor center, and that's one of the potentials. I believe that's a waste. It's 2016. Gen Xers and millennials use the internet and smartphones when they're traveling. And I think visitor centers are a thing of the past. And based on your own memos, these estimates that these contracts today appear to be inflated to me. And I'm not sure how any of us today can vote to move forward with this after voters said no. It was just less than a year ago, voters said no. And they'd really like to get their roads fixed, yet we can always seem to find money to move forward with these types of projects, which are nice to have. I'll agree with you. It would be very nice to have it. But we have necessities that we've been neglecting for years. So with that, I move to deny items 22 and 23 contracts for the renovation and rehab of the Old Courthouse.
Is there a second? No second. Motion fails for lack of a second. What's the pleasure of the board? Supervisor Elias.
Madam Chair, I'll go ahead and move items 22 and 23.
I think Mr. Huckelberry had a comment. Mr. Huckelberry?
Well, so he gets, all right. What?
No, I'll second, and then we'll let him make a comment.
Madam Chair, the voters did
I'm
approve
sorry.
renovation
He wanted to comment.
of the 2004 bond issue.
Madam Chair,
Supervisor.
I would only comment as a point of information that a previous comment indicated that they said no to the courthouse. I believe there was $160 million for roads as well that failed. That's right. So the same argument can be made for the roads.
Your logic's failed.
So.
Okay,
With
I'm not-
that is a point that I think is valid, Mr. Valadez. I would like to go ahead and move the consent calendar items. That would be 22 and 23. Poster frost, that would be my motion to approve. Then let's call the vote and vote on it.
I already did make that motion.
Yeah,
Well,
I
let's
know.
vote on
Just
it.
said
Let's call the vote.
There's the motion on the floor to approve items 22 and 23. Roll call.
Supervisor Carroll.
Aye.
Supervisor Elias.
Aye.
Supervisor Miller.
No.
Supervisor Valadez.
Aye.
Chair Bronson.
Aye. Motion carries. Moving on to item